Hey, English 10. This is week 3. We're starting week 3. And I'm looking at this craziness of hair right now. I know for you guys, you think that like my hair is already really short. It's like shaved down on the sides, even though it's grown in. But this is actually really long for me. And I'm just waiting till I can get it cut again. So forgive the messy bun thing. I haven't had a messy bun in years. So last week we talked a little bit about culture, and I tried to help you guys identify some elements, some aspects of your culture, and really particularly related to your ethnicity, like things that you might have gotten handed down through the generations. But I know that was kind of hard for some of you as we went through those assignments, because even though like you had some of those items, like foods that are traditional in your family, or clothing or style of dress, maybe it didn't really feel like yours. Okay, so you felt a little disconnected from some of that traditional stuff from your ethnicity, and there's some reasons for that, and I want to discuss a little bit about what happens when you have groups that, like, when people immigrate to the US and then when they have children and grandchildren here, and how those cultures get carried down and how they change. I talked about it a little bit in last week's video about like the fusion of cultures. And I think for this week's video, we really need to talk a little bit about American culture, where that comes from, because I think once you guys get your head wrapped around it, you'll find that that's what a lot of you, not all of you, but a lot of you identify with. So American culture, what it is, where it comes from, and why it's so hard to identify parts of American culture. Okay, so we're gonna have to jump into history just a little bit, just briefly. You really can't do English without history. I always tell people English and literature is just the emotional reflection of historical events. Okay, so like when you're reading a novel, right? There has to be some historical background for it. And that novel, that book, is just giving you the emotions of the characters. So history and English really interwoven. Kids get annoyed with it every year, like, oh, why do we have to learn the history of it? Because you do. You have to know history of things to understand what we're talking about. So to understand American culture a little bit, you need to look at the history of the US. So unlike a lot of other countries, it's very hard to pinpoint one particular part of American culture, like what defines American culture. And there's really two main reasons for that. One, our country is very young. Compared to other countries that have been around thousands of years, they have a lot of history and a lot of identity from that time. We've only truly been like settled, we've only had European settlers here since the 1600s. And only became our own country with our own identity since 1776, which is, the Declaration of Independence and whatnot. Now, that doesn't mean that there were not people here before that. Obviously, there were native tribes here, and their culture is still embedded in some of the things we do, but unfortunately, with the movements and just the history of the European settlement, a lot of that culture has drifted away. So you will find that culture in places, parts of Arizona, areas near like Indian reservations, even some of our like artwork and stuff that you see in America. Some of that does definitely have native roots, but it has been so mixed in with all the other immigrations over the years. Okay, so the first big immigration to the U.S. came from England, right? You had the group coming over from England. And I don't know the exact dates. That was on the East Coast that England came in. It was in the 1600s. And then on the West Coast, you had the push in from Mexico and Spain, right? I believe when it came in, it was Spanish-controlled Mexico that came into the West Coast. That's when you had Alta and Baja California, okay? So two different sides of the coast, two different major immigrations. And then as they settled, you just had more and more and more immigrations coming into the U.S. You had some major Irish immigrations in the 1800s. You had a big Italian immigration in the late 18 and early 1900s. You had, when you talk about Mexico in the West, Spanish settlers and Native Mexicans were always in California because they were the original, settling, like the original groups that settled California. But then when it was brought into the U.S. As a state, then you had that fusion of culture as well. Okay, so the thing with the U.S. is that you have had tons and tons of immigrant groups, and each one brings their own culture. So if I were to ask you guys to think about American culture, a few things that, like, if you think America, this is what you think of. It'd be kind of hard. So, I'll point out a couple of things that I think of as very, like, just your standard American stuff. And we'll start with food. Okay, hamburgers and fries. Those are very American. Pizza is very American. And, like, steak, potatoes, barbecue, right? That's very American. And those are traditionally, like, I've traveled overseas. I've been over to England, Scotland, Ireland. And if you find an American restaurant, because they do have, just like we have, like, Mexican restaurants and Chinese food, they have American food over there. It is going to be a lot of burgers, fries, and steaks, pizza. It's a really weird pizza, though. It's very strangely done. Their version of what our pizza is very weird. So American food, that is really what you're looking at. Burgers, fries, pizza, barbecue. When it comes to, like, American culture, like the different types of people, I think one of the things that comes to mind for a lot of people when they think of America is cowboys. But even cowboys aren't truly an American creation. Those were born, the American cowboy as we think of it, is a product of the vaqueros that came out of Mexico. And they came over here and they started businesses together, and the Western settlers, the people that were moving out of the East Coast and settling in the U.S., adopted some of those traits and that culture. What are some other ones that we think of as very American? Hip-hop. Hip-hop culture is actually probably pretty quintessentially American. I don't know if you guys can think of someplace else that it was born out of, but really hip-hop was born out of the American, like, inner cities, the 80s and 90s, right? Like that is truly where the roots of that come from. If you want to talk about, like, rock or punk or skater culture, a lot of that was born out of the British punk scene. So that's not even really genuine to America. Okay, so America is difficult to pin down because we've had so many groups. And what happens when you have later generations, so not that first group that came in from Italy or Mexico or China or wherever in Europe the families came from, that first group that came in, the first two people, husband and wife and kids or whatever, they usually do a pretty good job of retaining their culture, right? They still dress like they did when they were in their home country. They still cook the same food. Sometimes they never even learn English. My great-great-grandmother that came from Italy, she never learned English. Her daughter, who was born here, or no, I'm sorry, her son, who was born in Italy but moved here when he was, I think he was like less than a year old when she brought him over from Italy. He learned English, but later in life, when his own kids started school. So it wasn't really until the grandkids, the third generation, when English was picked up and started being spoken regularly instead of Italian in my family. Okay, so at that point, you're already, 3 generations in. Like, you have that first generation. That's when people say the first generation, those are the people that immigrated here. The second generation is the children of the people that immigrated here, and then the third generation is the grandchildren, so on and so forth. So it's real common for those first generations to maintain and retain a lot of their native culture. And when you have enough, when those groups are coming over large enough, or in large enough numbers, they retain a lot of that. It works its way into the fabric of American society. That's why when people think of American food, they think of things like pizza, which is Italian. If you think of like Californian food, everybody's going to say Mexican food, which obviously does not originate from California, right? So you have that first generation move, they tend to retain their culture. And then that second generation tends to retain quite a bit of the culture of their parents, but they also start adopting to some of the new maybe styles. Maybe they speak more English. Maybe their food tastes are different. What they prefer to eat is different. And even their style of dress and their mannerisms. So they start to adopt a little bit more of the culture surrounding them. And then by your third generation, it's usually pretty integrated. So like Mr. Castillo, for example, he's third generation. His grandparents came from San Luis Potosí, which is one of the states in Mexico. They were part of the Bracero program. They came over as farm workers in the 50s. They had lots and lots of kids, like 14 kids. I think my father-in-law, Mr. Castillo's dad, is like one of 14 kids. Okay? The older generations of kids, the ones that were born in Mexico, much less likely to, well, they're very bilingual. All the kids are very bilingual. But you can tell the older kids, the ones that were born in Mexico, retained a lot more of the Mexican traditions than the younger kids, the ones that were born in the U.S. And then with the grandkids, the third generation, some of them are bilingual, some aren't. Some still travel down to Mexico and, you know, visit and go there for vacation. Some don't. Mr. Castillo, I don't think, has been to Mexico since he was like a little baby. And, you know, he speaks some Spanish, like some conversational Spanish, but he's not really bilingual in it, or fluent. So that is the way that these traditions, these immigration groups, like they bring their culture with them, and then it gets embedded into American society. Okay, so for some of you guys, when I was asking you to identify culture based on your ethnicity, you struggled a little, right? Because maybe the food that your mom and your grandma cooked, that doesn't really resonate with you. And maybe you have a different style. And that, a lot of that is just born out of being a very young country with a lot of immigration. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with that. Doesn't mean that there's anything bad. This is just the normal transition. This is like the normal weaving of cultures. Okay, so as we move through this week, I'm going to have you do a couple of things. We're going to continue looking at, I told you guys, food. I love looking at culture through food because the food can tell you a lot. If you go to, like if there's a culture where the food, it's a lot of fish, right? It's a lot of fish and maybe a lot of like sweet flavors, like you get with Thai food. I don't know if you guys have ever had Thai food. You see it with Hawaiian food. And sometimes with Japanese food too. That usually tells you that it's from a tropical kind of culture, right? Probably an island. That's why there's so much fish. They're very reliant on fishing. So food can tell you a lot about the culture. And so the one thing we're going to do this week is a listen wise about food. Because like I said before, food is my favorite way to explore culture. So we do have a listen wise to do about that. I'm going to give you more time and more assignments that start helping you to identify your culture and to really kind of try to nail it down. And then we are going to go back and try to revise that poem. And then next week, we're going to start looking at some of the downside of culture. Not really downside, but the conflicts that can come out of culture. And things like stereotypes. Okay, stereotypes are a real interesting lesson when it comes to culture. So that'll be in my video for next week. I also wanted to ask you guys something, because I got to thinking about it, and like, I don't know if you guys ever watch, I don't know if you guys have seen me and Mr. Castillo around, but we play Pokemon Go, right? And when we watch the YouTube channels, they always have like cool names, like, hey guys, welcome to Trainer Tips, like let's jump into today's video. I want a cool name other than, hey, Englishton, it's Mrs. Castillo, what's up? So, can anybody think of a catchy but appropriate name for my YouTube channel? Be appropriate. Don't you guys send me anything bad. I swear that would not be good. If anything jumps out at you, if you can get anything off the top of your head, let me know, okay? All right, guys, I will talk to you tomorrow.